This is Unit 2B. It's on more renal physiology. It's focuses on the kidney's role and mechanisms in fluid and electrolyte balance. Now, electrolytes include both salts and acids and bases, and we'll talk more about acids and bases in 2C, Unit 2C. The electrolyte balance, when it's discussed, usually just refers to salt balances, so different types of electrolyte or ions, positive or negative charged ions, much wider than just sodium and chloride. Now, salts enter the body by being eaten, ingested, and are lost via perspiration, feces, and urine. They're extremely important in the maintenance and function of neuromuscular excitability, secretory activities, membrane permeability, and in controlling the movement of fluids, in other words, water, from the between the intracellular, interstitial, and intravascular compartments, back and forth between those three compartments. In terms of sodium in fluid and electrolyte balance, sodium holds a key central position. Sodium ions account for 90 to 95% of all the solutes in extracellular fluid, which means that of the normal level of 300 milliosmoles in extracellular fluid, usually about 280 milliosmoles is due to sodium salt. It's the most abundant cation in the extracellular fluid and the only one that can exert significant osmotic pressure. In other words, be able to cause the diffusion of water. In general, not always, not everywhere, because in some places it's sodium is permeable, but water is not, as we've discussed. But in general, and vice versa, but in general, where sodium goes, water will follow because of the osmotic effect of that sodium. The dominant role of sodium in controlling the volume of extracellular fluid compartments and the distribution of water is because sodium again is the only cation that exerts significant osmotic pressure or diffusion of water. Sodium ions leak into cells and then get pumped out against their electrochemical gradient. I remind you that all cells have sodium-potassium pumps, pumping sodium out and potassium in. And in that way, the sodium concentration is higher outside of cells in the extracellular fluid than in the intracellular fluid. And it tends to remain stable. It's maintained and regulated usually at a stable level. If there are any changes, if any changes occur in the plasma sodium level, so now we're talking about the intravascular fluid sodium level, they will affect the volume of the plasma. Because of the osmotic effect of the sodium, it will pull, if it rises, for example, it will be able to pull water from the interstitial fluid into the vasculature. And so changes in plasma sodium will affect plasma volume and therefore, of course, also plasma pressure. And because of any change in movement of water between compartments, that will also affect the intracellular fluid volume and the interstitial fluid volume. So you have to keep that in mind always, that there are two major water or fluid compartments, the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid, and that the extracellular fluid can be broken down further into two compartments, the interstitial fluid and the intravascular fluid. And fluid is constantly going to be able to move depending upon the osmolarity between compartments. And the main thing that causes water to move, or by osmosis, is the electrolyte concentration, and the major electrolyte is, in the end, sodium, responsible for that. As an aside, and we're going to talk about it more in Unit 2C, renal acid-base control mechanisms are always coupled together with sodium ion transport. Now, a major regulatory hormone in maintaining sodium balance is aldosterone, and it does that by causing sodium reabsorption in the kidneys. It will trigger sodium reabsorption in the kidneys. Most of the sodium that gets reabsorbed from the filtrate, that reabsorption is occurring in the proximal convoluted tubule. Another 25%, so now we're at 90%, is reclaimed in the loop of Henle. If aldosterone levels are high, if a lot of aldosterone has been secreted from the adrenal glands, the adrenal cortex, then all of the remaining sodium gets actively reabsorbed. And because of that, water reabsorption will also occur. It accompanies the sodium reabsorption. Now, sodium will be reabsorbed with high aldosterone, and the water will follow if you have permeability of the tubules. If permeability of the tubules has been induced by an increase in the ADH level, antidiuretic hormone level. Remember that antidiuretic hormone can induce expression of aquaporins, and aquaporins will allow the water to get reabsorbed. And here you see again, I showed you previously in Unit 2A the same diagram of formation of dilute versus concentrated urine. In the case of concentrated urine, you're getting more sodium going out, but less water, and that's because you have antidiuretic hormone being released, and that release of antidiuretic hormone allows for the movement of water from the collecting tubule and also from the distal convoluted tubule, so it gets reabsorbed. Normally, whatever water does come, it would be simply due to whatever water can move because of the salt pulling it. But when you get to get a concentrated urine, you need aquaporins, and therefore ADH expression. So the other thing that's related to urine, that's related to the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, is the fact that the renin-angiotensin mechanism will trigger release of the aldosterone. And that is mediated, of course, by the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which will, if activated, will release renin from juxtaglomerular cells. And that can occur in response to direct sympathetic nervous system stimulation toward sympathetic signals sent to the kidney, triggering renin release from juxtaglomerular cells, or if the osmolality of the filtrate in the distal convoluted tubule, I'll write it in here, in the distal convoluted tubule is lower, and the reason it would be lower is because there's not much filtrate being produced, right? And so the flow is low, and then there's lots of time to reabsorbed, or it will also, renin release will also be triggered if there's a decreased stretch of the afferent arteriole due to decreased blood pressure. So any of these things can help with renin release, and the renin released from the kidney will then act on a protein that's in the plasma, is produced as many, not all, but many soluble proteins in the plasma are produced by the liver. Angiotensinogen is. Angiotensinogen is cleaved and therefore activated by renin to form angiotensin 1, and then angiotensin 1 is cleaved, that is activated by angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, that's produced in the kidney, in the lungs, and that forms angiotensin 2 from angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 2 will act in the following ways. It acts as a general systemic vasoconstrictor. It will stimulate vasoconstriction in the systemic circulation, thereby raising blood pressure. It will also act to stimulate aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex. And the aldosterone, of course, acts on the kidneys to stimulate reabsorption of sodium and water. Now, another way that aldosterone can be released is by an elevated potassium level in the extracellular fluid. It actually, and we'll see it later, that there are effects on the potassium levels. If the potassium level is high, then you will get aldosterone release, and unlike with sodium, which it causes to be reabsorbed, it will cause the potassium to be released or excreted out in the urine. Aldosterone brings about its effects, which is a decrease in urine output and an increase in blood volume slowly. It's not a rapid response kind of thing. Here you see the flow chart for effects of aldosterone. So a low sodium in the blood plasma or a high potassium will trigger release of aldosterone. Also, of course, the renin-angiotensin mechanism will trigger release of aldosterone. There's stimulation of aldosterone release from the adrenal cortex. So it releases the aldosterone, and that acts on the renal tubules, the collecting duct, and will have effects on the renal tubules rather, and increase sodium reabsorption. And as I just mentioned, the effect is opposite on potassium. It'll trigger potassium secretion, and so you get back to normal homeostatic balance in the sodium and potassium levels, and that sends a negative feedback signal back to the adrenal cortex to inhibit further aldosterone release once it reaches normal levels. Okay, so this is once it attains a normal level. There are cardiovascular baroreceptors, as you know, in the aorta. You have the aortic bodies, and they have baroreceptors in them, and you also have in the coronary arteries, you have the carotid bodies. And these baroreceptors will send their sensory information into the cardiovascular centers, which are in the brain stem of the brain, in the medulla of the brain stem. So if blood pressure rises, and this is the situation we're talking about right now, if blood pressure rises, in that kind of a situation, what you want to do is lower the blood volume. So if blood volume has gone up for whatever reason, you have more water on board, then you will get sympathetic stimulate. It'll be detected by the baroreceptors because that will cause a increase in blood pressure. That causes an increase in the blood pressure, and that's detected by the baroreceptors, which send signals into the cardiovascular centers in the brain, triggering them to send out sympathetic impulses to the kidneys. I'm sorry, that's wrong. Triggering them to decrease their sympathetic output to the kidneys. So there's a drop in sympathetic output to the kidneys, and as a result, afferent arterioles in the kidneys will relax. You get vasodilation, so glomerular filtration rate rises. With afferent arterioles dilating, vasodilation, more blood can flow into the glomeruli, and the GFR and the hydrostatic pressure rises, the glomerular filtration rate rises, and sodium and water output increases. This is called pressure diuresis. This is a drop in. This is a sudden rise in blood pressure will trigger this lowering of sympathetic nervous system impulses to the kidney, causing a rise in GFR, and therefore a rise in sodium and water output, and that causes the blood pressure as a result of that to drop. If on the other hand you have a drop in blood pressure, the previous slide was about a rise in blood pressure. If there's a drop in blood pressure, you get the opposite responses to what was just shown. And those responses will result in an increase in systemic blood pressure, reestablishing an appropriate blood pressure. Since ion concentration essentially determines fluid volume, the baroreceptors can, in a sense, be considered to be sodium receptors because, as I said on the previous slide, if you have a rise in blood pressure, baroreceptors respond to that, and any rise in in blood volume causes an increase in blood pressure, and that's because of also more sodium being present, and so you'll get these the effects that cause result in a drop in blood pressure, or the opposite, which is shown here on this side. If you have too low a blood pressure, you'll get responses that result in an increase in fluid volume, increase in systemic blood pressure. In other words, it's really all responding really to sodium levels. If you salt your food a lot, you will also retain more water. Because if you put a lot of salt, if you have an increase in salt in your diet, then your plasma osmolarity will rise higher than 300 milliosmoles, and therefore you will retain more water. Water will move into the blood plasma from the interstitial fluid. You will be driven to drink more. You will have more fluid volume as a result, and therefore your blood pressure would rise. And as a result of that, you would have responses that I described on the previous slide. And the opposite would occur here if there's a drop in blood pressure associated with lower electrolytes taken in or less water taken in. All of the responses that I was talking about so far are shown here. These are responses for a drop in blood pressure. Okay, so they go with this is slide 14, so they go with this goes with slide 13. When you have a drop in blood pressure, and it says blood pressure / volume because the two are not separable. More volume of fluid in your vascular system will cause a rise in blood pressure. Less volume would cause a drop, but more would cause a rise. So here, declining systemic blood pressure is because of a declining volume. The two would go hand in hand. You get less stretching of afferent arterioles, and that would trigger the juxtaglomerular cells to release renin, and the renin acts on angiotensinogen to form angiotensin 1, which then gets acted on by ACE in the lungs to form angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 has a number of effects. One is that it will cause systemic arterioles to vasoconstrict. In that case, you have less space for that whatever the volume was in your bloodstream. So vasoconstriction, peripheral resistance rises with vasoconstriction. You have a rise in pressure. So that's what you wanted to affect, a rise in pressure, because it started with a drop in pressure, right, at the top there. So here you get a rise in pressure. The other thing angiotensin 2 does is it triggers the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone, and that acts on the renal tubules to cause an increase in sodium reabsorption and therefore water reabsorption, resulting again in an increase in blood volume and causing an increase in blood pressure. The other thing is a declining or drop in blood pressure, blood volume will trigger sends signals from baroreceptors into so the signals from the baroreceptors are picking up is a drop in blood pressure, and therefore the sympathetic nervous system output will increase, causing systemic arterioles to vasoconstrict. That's an increase. Vasoconstriction is associated with an increase in peripheral resistance. In other words, blood pressure rises. And finally, something we didn't discuss a lot, but a drop in blood pressure will trigger the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland to release ADH. Remember, the hypothalamus produces ADH, and then it goes down to the posterior lobe of the pituitary and gets stored there. And a drop in blood pressure / volume of the intravascular fluid will trigger ADH release from that posterior lobe, and that acts on the collecting ducts to induce aquaporins, and you get an increase in water reabsorption, causing essentially an increase in volume and therefore an increase in blood pressure. So drop in blood pressure here, and this, in your day-to-day life, if you have a drop in blood pressure, it does trigger all of these responses. You should be able to review this and understand it and be familiar with it. Now, the other thing about sodium balance and maintenance of sodium balance involving the kidneys is a hormone which has quite different effects from aldosterone, and that is atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. You may see it sometimes as atrial natriuretic factor, but ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide, is a better name, I would say. ANP is released from specialized cells in the wall of the atrium of the heart, which will release it in response to stretch. Now, the atrium of the heart stretch when blood pressure is higher, because the pressure they experience is higher. They get stretched, they release it. With that higher pressure, they're stretching, and they release it. ADH has potent diuretic and natriuretic effects. Did I say ADH? ANP has potent diuretic and natriuretic effects. Natrium is another word for sodium. That's why sodium, the symbol for sodium is Na, stands for natrium. So natriuresis is the release out, excretion of sodium. This ANP has strong diuretic, meaning water excretion, and natriuretic, meaning sodium excretion effects. Indeed, ANP will inhibit angiotensin II production. And therefore, as a result of that, you'll get a reduction in blood pressure and blood volume, which are two the things that go hand in hand. It does that by inhibiting all the events that promote vasoconstriction and inhibiting all types of things that cause sodium and water retention. So it's very effective at causing diuresis and natriuresis, release of sodium and release of water, and therefore leading to a reduction in blood pressure and blood volume. And this is a diagram that summarizes that. If you have higher pressure, therefore stretch of the atria in the heart, because that higher blood pressure, you get release of atrial natriuretic peptide, and its target tissues include the adrenal cortex. It will inhibit aldosterone release, therefore inhibiting sodium and water retention in the tubules and collecting ducts of the kidney, and therefore dropping the blood volume because you get less sodium and water reabsorption. Blood volume goes down, blood pressure goes down. The other thing it does is it will act on the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary to decrease antidiuretic hormone release. So it's an inhibitor of antidiuretic hormone release, and therefore inhibiting water reabsorption in collecting ducts and dropping blood volume and dropping blood pressure. And ANP acts on the juxtaglomerular cells, inhibiting renin release and therefore angiotensin formation, angiotensin II formation, and therefore it has an effect on the, the angiotensin II will cause vasoconstriction. So essentially you will get vasodilation and a drop in blood pressure. So all these effects of ANP are triggered by higher blood pressure and result in correction of that and drop of the blood pressure, and so you get then a negative feedback control mechanism that ends the initial the initial stimulus, which was stretching of the heart due to higher blood pressure. So it's a negative feedback regulatory loop. Are there other hormones that can affect sodium balance? Yes. Estrogens can have an effect. Females often would feel bloating or some edema, and generalized edema at different phases of the ovarian cycle, or the ovarian cycle. Progesterone, glucocorticoids, they can all have an effect. Glucocorticoids certainly have a retention effect on sodium and therefore water. Estrogens enhance sodium chloride reabsorption. They can cause water retention, not the ovarian cycle, the menstrual cycle, but I think you knew what I meant. Menstrual cycle. And they're also responsible for edema. There's more estrogen during pregnancy, and there can be responsible for some significant edema during pregnancy. Glucocorticoids also can enhance reabsorption of sodium and therefore promote edema, which is an increase in interstitial fluids, right? Okay. Progesterone, I haven't talked too much about that, but it's another important hormone produced in females and can decrease sodium reabsorption. So it has a diuretic effect, promoting sodium and water loss. All of these three have effects, but we're not going to get into them in great detail. Okay, we'll talk now about potassium balance. I did mention a little bit about potassium in that aldosterone does have an effect on potassium, and the effect is the opposite from its effect on sodium. The relative level or concentration of potassium in the intracellular fluid versus the extracellular fluid has a strong effect on the resting membrane potential of the cell. Remember that cells have an internal negative charge. That's the resting membrane potential. And that's very important, particularly for excitable cells, in allowing them to, under the right conditions, suddenly depolarize, go to the more positive, get excited, and trigger an impulse or action potential that can occur in nerves or in muscle. And potassium plays an important role in that. Of course, the whole establishment of that negative internal charge or voltage, the resting membrane potential, does involve the fact that the sodium-potassium pump is acting in those cells, pumping sodium out and potassium in. So potassium normally is higher inside the cell in the intracellular fluid than in the outside of the cell, the extracellular fluid. And it does have play a role in that membrane potential. As a result, if you have too high potassium in the extracellular fluid or too low, it can have an effect on the electrical conduction system in the heart and lead to sudden death. Indeed, if you have an excess level of potassium in the extracellular fluid, that will cause a decrease in the membrane potential. The opposite can also occur where you have too low potassium level in extracellular fluid, and that causes hyperpolarization and non-responsiveness to stimuli. So having the appropriate potassium level is extremely important, and the key tissue that is affected that could and can result in serious problems is in fact the heart. So in fact, shifts in potassium are related to hydrogen ion shifts, and you get opposite direction of movement between potassium and hydrogen, and that can, if the potassium levels are abnormal, it can interfere with the level of excitability of the cells. So, the pH has an effect. Okay, so in general, quite a bit of potassium gets into the filtrate. Remember the three activities, functions of the kidneys in terms of forming urine involve filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. And the potassium that gets into the filtrate, 85% of that is reabsorbed. So less than 15% is actually typically lost in the urine. Maintenance of the balance of potassium in the body is controlled in the collecting ducts. So that's what gets affected when things are out of balance, and that's what changes. How much potassium will be lost or not can change due to changes in the collecting ducts. And that's occurring because of the control on the amount of potassium that will be secreted into the filtrate. what you have is, if you have too high a potassium, then it will get excreted to higher degrees in the cortical collecting ducts. If potassium is low, then the amount of secretion and therefore excretion is kept to a minimum. So low potassium levels in the body, then secretion, excretion is kept to a minimum. Excess amounts, then secretion into the collecting ducts rises, and therefore the amount lost in the urine rises. So, in fact, excess or high potassium content in the extracellular fluid will favor the cells that line the collecting ducts to secrete potassium, and low potassium levels will decrease secretion into the collecting ducts. So it's all occurring in the collecting ducts, that control of the appropriate plasma. Remember, the plasma is the extracellular fluid, or at least a major part of the extracellular fluid, and the main thing being filtered in the kidneys, obviously. Aldosterone also has, this is a repeat of what I said before, aldosterone does have an effect on potassium. It will stimulate potassium ion secretion by those cells that line the collecting ducts. And in fact, for every sodium that is reabsorbed, a potassium ion is secreted. If you do have increased levels, excess levels of potassium in the extracellular fluid around the adrenal cortex, it will trigger release of aldosterone, and aldosterone will cause an increase in potassium secretion. So potassium essentially controls its own extracellular fluid concentration by feedback regulation of aldosterone levels, or release into the plasma, the aldosterone levels in the plasma. Calcium is another electrolyte ion, a cation that is carefully regulated in the body. It's extremely important in many enzymatic reactions. They have to have calcium there. Just to name a few, the blood clotting pathway, the clotting factor activation pathway, that cascade of factors, which are all proteins. Many of them need calcium to be active. Cell membrane permeability is affected by ionic calcium levels in the extracellular fluid, and it's also very important in the ability of secretory cells to carry out their secretion. It is controlled, in fact, by a hormone called the parathyroid hormone. It's also controlled by calcitonin, but much more so by parathyroid hormone. That's a major hormone controlling calcium levels or calcium balance. I would remind you, it's not on the slide, but I would remind you that for the parathyroid hormone, or PTH, is in fact produced by the parathyroid glands. You have 4 parathyroid gland lobes associated close to the thyroid gland in your neck. Okay, parathyroid hormone is produced by the parathyroid glands. There are 4 lobes. Very important for appropriate calcium levels, and therefore many metabolic activities in the body. If you have a low calcium, which is called hypocalcemia, it will increase excitability of excitable tissue like muscles, and can even cause muscle tetany, which I remind you is a very rapid, continuous contractions of the muscles, and can even lead to complete tetany, which is like a constant contraction of the muscle. If you have high levels, that's low levels of calcium. If you have high levels of calcium, which is called hypercalcemia, it can inhibit excitable tissues. Now, it will cause many effects, but in terms of, this is excitable tissue, neurons, nerve tissue, and muscle. So it can inhibit neurons and muscle cell activity and can even lead to heart arrhythmias. Big problem. Calcium and phosphate tend to go together in terms of the regulation. If you have calcium reabsorption, you will get phosphate excretion. They will go hand in hand that way. Calcium out. If calcium's back in, reabsorbed from the filtrate, phosphate will be excreted. The parathyroid hormone coming from the parathyroid glands promotes an increase in blood calcium. It does that by targeting 3 ways that the body can get more calcium into the blood plasma. One is from the bones. The parathyroid hormone will act on osteoclasts. I remind you that osteoclasts are cells in the bone that eat or phagocytose and break down the material of the bone matrix, the secreted material that was made into bone, right? Bone matrix. So it'll activate those osteoclasts to break down the bone matrix and release more calcium into the plasma. It will act on the small intestine to increase intestinal absorption of calcium from food that you eat, and it'll act on the kidneys to enhance calcium reabsorption from the filtrate and decrease phosphate reabsorption. So it does have an effect also on phosphate, but opposite from calcium. So if your calcium levels are low, then your parathyroid hormones normally respond to that and increase your parathyroid glands respond to that and secrete more PTH, and that will act on bone osteoclasts to increase breakdown of bone. It'll act on the small intestine to increase absorption of calcium from food, and it'll act on the kidneys to increase calcium reabsorption from the filtrate. Now, normally when phosphate gets into the filtrate, it gets actively reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubules. And if there isn't any PTH around, then phosphate reabsorption is regulated by, transport mechanisms are operating, and as long as they're not saturated, the phosphate gets reabsorbed. But if there's a lot of phosphate, then the ability to reabsorb is saturated and the excess goes out in the urine. So that's a normal kind of way that phosphate's handled, gets into the filtrate. A lot of it gets reabsorbed, but if there's too much, then it'll exceed the ability to reabsorb and it goes out in the urine. However, if you have high or normal extracellular calcium levels, that can inhibit PTH secretion. Remember, PTH will only get secreted if calcium levels drop below normal. And as a result of that higher normal calcium level, you don't have release of calcium from the bones. More calcium is lost out in the feces and the urine, and more phosphate can be retained. Okay, now the other hormone I mentioned that does have an effect on calcium metabolism or regulation calcium levels is called calcitonin. And I remind you that calcitonin is actually released by specialized cells in the thyroid gland, separate from the lobules that are producing thyroid hormone. And it gets released in response to a rise in blood calcium levels. So that's the opposite of parathyroid hormone. It is, in fact, an antagonist of parathyroid hormone. It acts in the opposite way. However, its contribution to calcium and phosphate levels and regulation of those levels, the homeostatic regulation, is pretty minor. Most regulation is due to PTH. There are anions that are important and they are regulated. Chloride is the major anion that's key in the body. It accompanies sodium in the extracellular fluid. Normally, chloride that gets into the filtrate in the kidneys, in the the filtrate that's first formed in the glomerular or Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule, 99% of that gets reabsorbed if there are normal pH levels. If, however, you have a lower pH, acidosis, then less chloride ions are reabsorbed. All the other anions, negatively charged electrolytes, have typically, they get in the filtrate and, they'll get reabsorbed, but if they hit their transport maximum, if there's a lot more of them than normal, then they get excreted out. And that's the end of Unit 2B. It's on that was on electrolyte and fluid balance. I remind you that at all times, I want you to realize that at all times your body is trying to regulate your electrolyte levels so that the osmolality of the blood plasma is at 300 milliosmoles. And if it goes up, then the body will try and reduce it, and it'll reduce it by retaining water and trying to excrete out the excess electrolyte. But the first thing will be, drinking more water, keeping more water in. And if it goes too low, below the 300 level, there's a range, of course, around 300 that's perfectly normal, but it tries to stay fairly close to 300. And if it goes below that, then you will tend to put more water out or tend to retain more electrolytes, okay, in general. One way that's done in terms of, let's say if you have a higher than 300 milliosmol plasma, that will cause fluid, water from inside the cells to get pulled into the extracellular fluid. Okay, that's dehydration essentially. Okay, let's move on. This is the end of Unit 2B. Last slide.